Well, hello everyone. I'm doing this on a different computer, and as you can tell today it's a little bit cold. The start of winter's coming in, and so I'm slightly rugged up. I thought I would just talk briefly about my experiences having lived under many Australian Prime Ministers, and give you an update on what I think who are the best and who are the worst. For the first over 20 years of my life, of course, that I can recall, I lived under the Prime Ministership of Bob Menzies, who I think started in 1948. It was well before I was born in 41, but well before I took much interest in politics. And I'm not too sure the exact date, probably about 1964-5. He finally retired. So virtually all my growing up period, where I was aware, were under Bob Menzies. Now Bob remained in power mostly because of the antics of the DLP. The ALP split into two, into the original Labor Party, and there was a splinter group, a very large splinter group, broke off, the Democratic Labor Party, and they gave their preferences to the Liberals. And that kept Labor out of power for many, many years. Bob Menzies oversaw an enormous development in Australia during that time, and I think the country did pretty well under him. He retired, and then Harold Holt took over. Harold Holt was not in office very long when he disappeared into the surf off Portsea. So not really much to say about him. He was an understudy of Bob Menzies. Then we had a very brief period with John McEwen. Blackjack McEwen stood in since they were trying to figure out what to do when Harold Holt was lost. Then there was an election not long after, and John Gray Gorton, who was a senator at that stage, became Prime Minister. He was I suppose a bit of a knockabout bloke. I do believe he was a pilot in the war. I don't think he had anything really to write home about. There was a lot of backstabbing going on in the Liberal Party at this stage, and the next one on the stage, in fact, was Billy McMahon, with his very tall wife, who most people remember wore a dress with a slit from her ankles all the way up to almost her thighs. So by this stage it was about 1972, and virtually for all of my life I've been living under Liberal Party Prime Ministers. And there was a groundswell against this. They'd been in too long, and there were a number of things, including concerns about the Vietnam War, but many other areas as well, that really needed a new eye. And with a magnificent pre-election performance, Gough Whitlam and the ALP won with the famous "It's Time" banner, and they had quite a decent win. The problem was, of course, they hadn't been in office for many, many years, and Gough and his team did a number of excellent things, but also they were pretty well out of control in many others. And it was necessary that we had a change. It was a great shame that his team were so unreliable. And of course then a couple of years later, came the dismissal, following the fact that the Liberal Party denied supply, which meant the public service couldn't be paid, and most of the services in Australia funded by the Commonwealth would stop. Gough's party was dismissed by our Governor-General Kerr's Kerr, as Whitlam called him, and in the following election, very much to my surprise, Malcolm Fraser got in quite comfortably. So he was there for about 6 years, totally useless in my view, was not great. And you might add that at this stage there's not too many Prime Ministers that I would have given you 2 bob for. We'll come back to those later on. In 1980, Bob Hawke and the ALP won, and Bob was there for 8 years. He, in fact, was, in my view, a very good Prime Minister. He did just what was necessary, and we'll come back, as I say, to the good, the bad and the ugly later on. He was then, in the normal manner of Australian politics, stabbed in the back by Paul Keating, and then we had, for our sins, Paul Keating for a few years. Then John Howard came in. Around about 2000, John Howard came in, and he was there for probably 8 years, I would think. And then, of course, we had the roundabouts starting. We had Kevin Rudd come in for a while. Julia Gillard, Kevin Rudd. Hopeless period of time by the Labor Party, followed by Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison, and now we are labouring, and I use the word in any sense you like, under Anthony Albanese of the Labor Party. So that's the summary of the Australian Prime Ministers. Now let's have a look at the good, the bad and the ugly. Bob Menzies obviously was I think a fellow who does deserve credit. He did oversee enormous economic expansion within Australia. He was lucky that the DLP allowed him to stay in office for so long, but I think he did a pretty good job. Gough did some excellent things. He was needed, but his party and he really had no discipline and no economic ideas at all. Gough, I think, was necessary. He did a good job for the country overall, but it's probably just as well he wasn't in for any longer. Then we move on to Bob Hawke. Bob, I think, was an excellent Prime Minister. He managed to balance the crazies within the ALP with economic sense, and for those 8 years I think Bob deserved a lot of credit. So he's probably at this stage the best of the Prime Ministers that I've laboured under. Paul Keating, I'm just going to pass over at the moment. John Howard. John was perhaps the best Prime Minister during my lifetime at least. He was disciplined, he was solid, he was an excellent Prime Minister on every count. No question of this at all. Then, of course, we look at the remainder, and I think we can just ignore those. So when we really look at the Prime Ministers that I think have been important to this country, number 1, John Howard, number 2, Bob Hawke, an honourable mention with a real question mark to Gough Whitlam. Now let's talk about the ugly, and there's a few of those as well. Dearie me. Most of the early days were okay. Billy McMahon was, I think, just a figurehead, not particularly useful. Paul Keating, I think, is probably the worst Prime Minister that I've had to put up with in my lifetime. Arrogant, thoughtless, a very, very difficult person in my view, and a very, very poor Prime Minister indeed. It's a shame that he just didn't let Bob Hawke stay on. So I'd put Paul towards the bottom of my list. At the moment he is the bottom of my list. And then now we get down to Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, and the roundabouts that will happen there. Well, now we have 3 groups of poor Prime Ministers: Gillard, Rudd and Keating. I think Tony Abbott was not given a fair drum, to be quite honest. I don't think that he was given a fair go by the media. I think he was quite an adequate Prime Minister, but his role is just not recognised. Malcolm Turnbull, he's right up there with Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard and Paul Keating. Scott Morrison, again, I think was not given a fair go by the media. I think he was actually quite a reasonable Prime Minister. Anthony Albanese, he is looking as though he might join the also-rans at this stage. We've had 3 years of him and he's achieved nothing, and it's likely he'll get back for the next election as well. So at the moment, amongst our also-rans, and they're all in the last 20 years or so, 20 or 30 years, Paul Keating, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard, Malcolm Turnbull, all of those, I think, have to be in the poor quality people. Now, where to place them in order is extremely difficult. I think I would put Paul Keating and Kevin Rudd at the bottom of my list, but closely followed by the remainder of them. The rest of them are just making up the numbers. We've not had a decent Prime Minister since about 1990. My apologies, with the exception of John Howard, since about 1990. But there seems to be no one showing at this stage that's likely to lead Australia the way that it should be read. It's somewhat depressing when you look at that. So there we go. The top Prime Ministers, in my view, Bob Hawke and John Howard. And the worst Prime Ministers, well, we'll share it. Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard and Paul Keating, with a nod to Malcolm Turnbull. What a shambles. Oh well, that's the story of my thoughts, at least, on Australian Prime Ministers. And with that, bye for now.